Hello, this is Tony Gaddis, author of Starting Out with Java. In this video, we're going to talk about variables and how to declare variables in a Java program. Programs work with data, and in order for a program to work with a piece of data, it has to store that data somewhere in the computer's memory. Well, that's where variables come in. A variable is a name that represents a storage location in the computer's memory. When a program stores a piece of data in memory, it typically does so with a variable. Commonly, we say that we are storing a piece of data in a variable. Well, that simply means that we're storing the data in the computer's memory, and we're using the variable to identify the location where that data will be stored in memory. In the process of designing a program, one of the things that you have to do is determine the variables that the program will need, and that means that you'll have to make up names for those variables. Now, a variable's name should reflect the meaning of the data that it holds. For example, suppose a program needs to store in memory the distance between two cities. Well, we would need to create a variable to hold that piece of data, and we might name that variable distance. This name gives an indication as to what the data is. It's a distance. Suppose we have another program that performs nutritional calculations, and one of the pieces of data that it stores in memory is the number of calories for a particular food item. Well, we would need a variable to hold that data, and we might name that variable calories. Now, you might be wondering, why do we have to use these descriptive names for variables? Why can't we just use simple names like A or B or X and Y? After all, in mathematics, we are accustomed to using simpler names to represent variables. Why can't we do that in a computer program? Well, you can do that in a computer program, but it's not a good practice. And the reason is that computer code should be written in such a way that when a programmer reads the code, he or she can figure out what the code is doing, can understand how the program works. One of the ways that you can write your code so that it's understandable is to use descriptive names for the variables. Now, once you've determined that you want to have a variable in your program, you create that variable with a variable declaration. A variable declaration is a statement that tells the compiler, hey, I want to have a variable with a particular name in this program. Now, the variable declaration contains two pieces of information. First, it specifies the variable's data type. That's the type of data that you want to store in the variable. And the second piece of information is the variable's name. So here I have a Java program, and let's say that I want to create a variable named distance, and I want to store integer numbers in that variable. Well, I would declare the variable like this. Start with the word int. That's the keyword that means the integer data type. And then I write the name of the variable, distance, and then I finish it with a semicolon. After writing the variable declaration, I can write other statements that perform operations with the variable. For example, suppose I want to store a value in the variable. I can use an assignment statement to do that. Distance equal 500. That stores the integer value 500 in the distance variable. And I can display the contents of the variable with system.out.println. Now, if we were to execute this program, we should see the number 500 appear on the screen. Well, let's compile the program. And it compiles successfully. And let's run the program. And there's the output, 500. It's important to point out that a variable has to be declared before it can be used in a program. For example, in this program, if we read the code in the main method from the beginning of the method to the end, we see that the variable declaration for distance appears first, And then we have these other statements that perform operations using that variable. If we had neglected to write the declaration for the distance variable, the program would not compile because we have to declare variables before we can use them. Also, if we had declared the variable later in the method, for example, if we had declared it down here after the system.out.println statement, the program wouldn't compile either, because the declaration has to be written before any statements that perform operations with that variable. In the previous example, we used the int data type to declare the distance variable. When we declare a variable to be of the int data type, that means that it can store only integers. The int data type can hold values like 7, 5, and -12. Well, what if we need a variable that can hold fractional values? Well, we need another data type besides int. Typically, in Java, we use the double data type when we want a variable that can store numbers such as 3.5, 1.456, or -4.2. We call those floating point values. This is an example of a Java program that uses a double variable. Here in the main method, in this statement, we have declared a double variable named balance. And then in this statement, we are assigning the value 1234.56 to the balance variable. And then in this statement, we're using system.out.println to display the value in the balance variable. Well, let's run the program and see what happens. So there's the value of the balance variable, 1234.56. Well, int and double are only two of the data types that Java provides. Java actually provides a number of data types, and these are all discussed in Chapter 2 of your textbook. To give you a brief summary, these data types are used for storing integer values. These two data types are used for storing floating point values. The char data type is used to store characters like letters of the alphabet. And then the Boolean data type is used to store the values true and false. Even though Java gives you all of these different data types, you'll find that most of the time you'll be using the int data type to store integers and the double data type to store floating point values. Occasionally you may use some of these other data types, but most of the time you'll be using ints and doubles. Before we conclude the video, let's summarize the rules and the guidelines that you need to follow when you are making up variable names. First of all, variables should have meaningful names. You should avoid variable names like A, B, X, Y, names that don't really convey the meaning of the data that is stored in the variable. If a person's gross pay is going to be stored in a variable, go ahead and name the variable gross pay. Second, variable names must begin with a letter, an underscore, or a $sign. After the first character, the remaining characters in a variable name can be letters, digits, underscores, or $signs. Variable names cannot contain spaces. The variable name gross space pay is not really a variable name because you can't have a space in a variable name. And finally, uppercase and lowercase letters are distinct. If you have a variable named distance, which is all lowercase letters, then the name distance, which begins with an uppercase D, would be the name of a totally different variable. That's because uppercase characters and lowercase characters are distinct. Chapter 2 gives a summary of these rules and guidelines.